Okay, first of all, I want to welcome everyone here in the great room as well as alumni house here at Yale. And I also want to welcome all of you who are participating via streaming radio. At least by registration, we have 171 registered, which about 35, which looks like we have registered here here in the Great Hall, and the rest by streaming radio. So, and it's mostly students with some mixture of alumni. This is the 13th Yale career panel that has been held in the last 3 years, and we've covered a whole variety of different professions, whether it's legal or entrepreneurism or nonprofit or education. This time we thought we'd do something slightly different, and that is, for those of us who recruit here at Yale, what we find from time to time is that the students have an dilemma, not necessarily about whether they want to join the program, but trying to decide between consulting, personality, and investing. They tend to be clustered, so I think that people are thinking of drama film and not be the ones who are thinking about investment banking. But there seem to be clusters. So we thought, why not have one where we have some panelists who've been in more than one profession around sort of a group of professions that typically students are trying to pay between. And what I understand with some help from the Yale Career Strategy Office, that a very common dilemma is between consulting, investment banking, and investing. So Greg, Paul, and I are the two panelists, and each of us has been at least two of those professions. I was originally at Bain Company when I first got started in consulting, and I was at J. Sweeney, which was a private equity firm, and then for the last 20 years, I've been in investment banking. Greg will talk about his career, but he was at McKinsey for many years, and he's now on the investing side. The last thing I want to say is just how we want to organize this. Those of you who read the invitation, there were 4 questions. What are the key job similarities and differences between professions? Second, what are the characteristics that people intend to do well and are happy in each of the professions? Third, what questions would you ask yourself when you were trying to decide between those professions? And last, what should you ask recruiters to sort out that versus the. So we thought this time, instead of our giving speeches for 30, 40 minutes, instead we take the hour and divide it into 15 minutes, and for each question, we'll make some comments, but then we'll use the remaining 15 minutes to really answer questions for us to have a discussion. So we'll give that a try and see what it works. Let me turn it over to Greg to talk about his own background, and then after that, we'll get into the first question.
Great. I'll just take a minute. I studied administrative science here at Yale. A major that no longer exists. It was wiped out and it's now part of the School of Management. The reason I did that was so that I could take the maximum number of introductory courses and get the broadest array of things. And there'll be a theme that I come back to later on. After Yale, I intended to go to business school, but my grandmother asked me to go to law school, so I went to law school, which is an added part of my career. I spent 5 years in a law firm in New York City, both in New York and in California, at which point I joined McKinsey and Company, and I was there for 16 years. And spent a little time after McKinsey consulting in the finance and tax area, and then started Spring Mountain Capital, firm I'm currently with in 2001. Spring Mountain Capital focuses on hedge fund and private equity investing, as well as, interestingly, municipal bond investing, both investment grade as well as structured finance for charter schools, environmental facilities, and senior living facilities. So the thing I would say as an opening remark is the same advice I give to most of the young people I talk to, is just not to stress too much about the decisions, because you really have plenty of time to do all of them, and the skill sets you acquire in one profession, I believe they're transportable to any, other than the law. You got to go to law school for that. But outside of that, that's
Okay, one of the things Brad and I talked about, which is a little bit beyond, we'll explain how we're solving it. If you look at each of those professions, consulting, investment banking, and so forth, each one has a lot of very different segments and subsegments. For example, investment banking, you do M&A, also you can do sales or marketing, you can do trading, and those are very different. So to solve that dilemma, since obviously we can't go through 5 different segments of investment banking, etc., we're just going to focus on the ones that are. The good news is that Yale students tend to go into a relatively concentrated part of each of those professions, right? So we're going to direct our comments about the profession, that aspect of, say, consulting and so forth, is the most common destination, right? And that's going to be the most useful, I think, to you. So let's start with the first question, which is what are the key similarities and differences between the professions? In a very good comment, which is actually part of the reason why people have a dilemma between these three professions is, in terms of the skill sets, they're not dramatically different if you compare them to, say, a lot of other professions. They're all highly analytical. They all involve working very heavily with people. It's not one of those things where you, for 5 years, you write a book or do research, you don't have to talk to people. They're all similar in that respect, right? And that's a lot of different things to break down as well. But also, I would comment that the entry point, you want to also make sure you understand that the point of the profession that you would enter into as a young person is very different than, say, other entry points in the profession. So, for example, investing, to be very, very simplistic, if you come in at junior level, you do just basic analytical work and so forth, and research, that's very different from people who come in, say, a venture firm, private equity firm, at a very senior level, which is also a very common way to get there. And so you have to understand, that difference. So the first thing is just that the analytical and interpersonal things are different, are very similar, but also you have to understand that there's more than one entry point for each of the professions. And you're thinking about a junior entry point, right?
Yes, thank you. I think shall we start? Some of the.
That's the first, I started the first question.
Right.
That was my answer to the first question.
Okay. If I look at management consulting, most individuals who come out of college are going to go into, if you went into a McKinsey, go into the business analyst program which moves you, makes McKinsey look-see at your talent, and then they decide whether or not they might sponsor you to business school, and that gives you a couple years of practical experience, then you go into business school, and then you come back as an associate. The business analyst, I think, I observed that, number one, they're doing analytical work, as Peter points out. I think in a strategic consulting firm, like McKinsey, you will do less in terms of numbers. You might crunch numbers, but you're not creating numerical analyses. You're just bringing in survey data, numbers from looking at comparables in terms of cross industries. You're looking at comparisons and so forth. But you're not doing a lot in terms of financial analysis, whereas you might do that as an associate in the investment banking side. I think in terms of the work environment in all the places, other than in shops such as ours, which is an independent standing smallish firm. In the large firms, I think the work demands are pretty high. One point I thought in investment banking, with the orientation toward deals, the timetables on deals, just the observations that people just spend enormous hours when they have a deal. But when I talked to the business analysts at McKinsey, then when I was there and now, the demands are equally as pressing. Partly because they get these open-ended assignments. Get some data, get some information on this that I can put on things to a client from I'm billing multiple millions of dollars to assume that you know nothing. Right? And there there's such an emphasis on proving that the firm actually knows something, even though it's employing fairly junior people, that the pressures of just getting that information and finding it, hunting it down, going beyond simply a Google search, for example. So I think the similarities are, yes, analytical, the numbers, the type of analyses might be different in a consulting firm versus an investment banking. What's more emphasis on evaluation, analyses?
I would go beyond that though. I'll be honest, I actually feel that there's some significant businesses how their day-to-day life is. I'll point out that consulting tends to be put on a project, and that's a big distinction between projects, right? Some cost reduction project or some strategy project for a company. You might at most work on 2 projects at the same time because of major consulting. Investment banking, you may or may not be put on a project. You might, or they might just have you doing textbooks and things like that, and lots of little things to go for. And I think I would encourage all of you to talk to people who are doing that. I mean, if you're junior, you might know someone who graduated 2 years before. Talk to them about it. And so it's a different kind of experience, and they tend to slot you in because you put into investment banking, you tend to be put into a pool, an analyst pool, and then there's some of the science people. So it's a different kind of experience. So consulting, you tend to be on teams, you put on a team that might be a 6-month project, so forth, or 2 teams, 2 projects. Investment banking, you tend to be put on discrete tasks, which may or may not be the project long term, but maybe just a task that lasts for 2 days. And it feels different. They can feel quite different actually, right, when you think about it. And then the private equity venture side is very interesting because, quite frankly, they actually just need people. And I think that I remember I went to our business school and I used to give a speech about venture capital, and 200 people would show up, and I said, the sad thing about it is there aren't 200 jobs available in venture capital. And yet there are 200 people here for one school, right? So consulting is labor intensive, you need a lot of others. Investment banking is labor intensive, private equity venture you don't. So just recognize that the role and the number of job positions available is relatively limited, right?
Yeah, and venture capital will have some of the same attributes as you mentioned in investment banking. We have right now in our shop, just in our private equity division, we have about 35 investments. We're looking at about 20 or so. The team is composed of 4 managing directors and 2 vice presidents. So it's a very lean team out there. When we need the expertise to drill down, we might hire an accounting firm, an investment banking firm to supplement our skills in the area. But the transaction flow will be fairly diverse versus the project orientation, which Peter mentioned. And as an associate, you might very well be delegated to just 2 studies, maybe 1 mega study, and you'll have that as a focus for a few months.
So there are some real differences. But I think there's more similarity between investment banking and consulting than there is the propositions that all of you would, be thinking about than there would be in private venture. Would you say that's probably correct?
Yes, the interestingly in the venture world, I think in the private equity world, you'll see a preference to hire out of the investment banking ranks versus the consulting ranks. I find.
Whenever I've got 4 emails saying the sound is difficult, so you might be able to between it.
Sure.
Apparently people have some difficulty hearing. So the other though is, this 2 years, right? And consulting and then going to business school, 2 years investment banking. I think a little different in investment because they tend to hire people regularly, so they don't have a structured program. But I think these programs are also going through change. And you read all these articles about how certain some investment banks have now said, okay, we don't have to work on weekends, we'll turn off the emails so people can't reach you, so on. I don't think it's because people are suddenly trying to be nice. I think it's because there's been a backlash about the lifestyle. Because if we can't do investment banking, typical financial analysts, they work tremendous hours, 100 hours a week and so forth, and have very little control over what they do. Now, I'll say that part of that is not because it's necessary, it's because it's the tradition. Just like medical school, okay, being a resident. You ask doctors, is it necessary for doctor residents to work 40 hours or 72 hours or so forth? And they'll say, no, but that's the way we've always done it. Right? That's what they say, right? Now you ask, well, is this bad for the patient? And they don't want to answer the question. Well, the reality is that cancer programs, in part, are being done that way because that's the way they're used to doing it, not because it's necessary to have to be done that way. And it's in flux now because I think they've gotten such, to be honest with you, they're losing a lot of people to their businesses, basically. So they're not doing it because they say, well, you know, we really ought to be nicer to the analysts. It's because they started losing to people, right? So that's when they're trying to react. So that's one thing you ought to think about, and as you were talking to other people are thinking about it, try to see whether you can get a real story, right? But see beyond the superficial and say, well, we're trying to make features so forth. Try to ask yourself, what really was going on and why are they trying to make this shit, right? So not all firms are the same. In my firm, we only have $100 a week because we think it doesn't make any sense, right? And so we don't have to worry about giving people weekends off. But I was at Union and I was at Salon Brothers, and that's the way we do it. Right? So let's open up this session to any questions you might have on the issue of how you compare the professions. You want to come up and speak loud, especially since we have a microphone.
Certainly, of course. Should I bring the floor?
Over here, so.
So my question is about the kind of transferability of skills between the different professions. So you highlighted the fact that a lot of the skills are similar. If someone is in consulting and decides they want to switch to investment banking or vice versa, how difficult is that to do? And how comparable are the skills as you're moving on?
Let me bifurcate my answer a little bit on that. I personally think that if you do one well, you can do all the others well. And that's because I have a fundamental belief that when you're in business and an enterprise, fundamentally you're trying to understand valuation and the creation of value, which is in any one of those things. You need the skills of being able to read and critically think about what you read, to write and express yourself. If you have that talent set, you can actually do any of the following. Now, the two impediments of making the transition is the embedded presumptions. So when we take a look at, if you come out of law school and you're an investment banker, they'll assume that you don't necessarily have the skill set to do that. You don't have the numerical financial training. But nevertheless, if we drill down on it, we realize that the same steps of valuation, they're not that complicated. Anything that someone knows technically, you call risk or not to pick up, unless you're really bad with numbers. And so the transition part is difficult because of the presumptions of the people who are already in the group. If you can penetrate that by showing in what you've done in one place, an interest and perhaps some of the skills necessary in the other place, that's fine. And then have the philosophical sameness. Take one more second on, or one more half minute on the answer to your question. For example, if I have a lawyer in mergers and acquisitions trying to become an investment banker, just not everybody get involved in transactions versus simply documenting them. The main factor is for the lawyer to stop looking at risk and trying to avoid it, and doing what a business person does, which is to identify risk and embrace it to make a profit. Once you make that transition, mentally, you can actually move between the two worlds. So it's simple things like that, but the difficulty is the embedded presumption that you wanted to do something else and this was a late stage change and you might not. If you can penetrate that, I think you may.
I would disagree with Greg on one point, and that is I think that, and having been in strategy consulting and having been in, venture capital, having been in investment banking, I think that the private equity and the consulting require much greater ability to understand businesses and how they work and don't work in strategy than investment banking. The typical investment banker has a very superficial understanding of the strategy of the businesses, so because it's a more numbers thing: financing, credit ratio, multiple EBITDA, debt to EBITDA. These are not necessarily. There's some little bit element of business. Right? Is it a cyclical business or is it a specialty business? But fundamentally, to be an investment banker, you don't necessarily have to understand at the same level of depth how good the business is and their strategy. And by the way, I'm actually not sure that people who are universally good at all those things. Right? There are some people who are just numbers people. They're just numbers people, and they can do numbers like you wouldn't believe. But if you ask them, what's the best strategy for that donut shop, they might have a lot of trouble, right? Likewise, there are people who are really good at strategy, but you ask them, okay, do evaluation of a public company and whether it could go public and so forth, and they might have trouble. So I'm not totally disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that of those three professions, consulting clearly is much more business oriented. Private equity is sort of in the middle because there's a valuation and a financial element to private equity which you have to deal with, right? But there's still the business side. And then investment banking has some business element that's much more numbers oriented in valuation and markets and so forth. So if you tend to just really like to understand the strategy of a business, you might be more interested in the consulting side or parts of the private equity rather than, so I'll tell you, sales and trading, they could care less about strategy, right? They could care less. It just, do I think if I short this stock, it's a totally different animal.
So, if just to carry the discussion a little bit further, if I look at organizations that are complete, they have generally two types of outstanding individuals. They have experts who might be super numbers people, and they have generalists. And experts who might be particularly insightful in technology, some other natural science, or numbers. So we have, for example, at Spring Mountain, we have quants, the quant group, right? And these are all PhD mathematicians, right? And that just gives us an insight into relationships, numerical relationships and modeling. But at the same time, when we make decisions in our committee, we want people who have seen the totality of things and are actual generalists. And so I think even if you went to an investment banking division that's a top, or even in a consulting team, as we try to put a consulting team together for a particular client, right? We look for the guy who had the number skills. We look for the guy who had the sector competence or the practice competence, if it was an operational effectiveness study, who just liked drilling down to the facts, knew everything about operational effectiveness. And then the generalists, because we were strategic consultants. And that was a composition of a team. And if you start out as an individual, you're going to be, practicing trying to get one of the things, but eventually, if you open your mind up, I think a person who does one thing, I know our numbers people with a little bit of training and mind opening could probably make the transition to
to a more generalist field.
But it's not necessary, you know, you just don't know really until it happens. By the way, one other comment, two comments. One is probably more important than what we're saying is that all of you should try to really get to know yourself properly. Get to know, get an honest view about what you're good at and what you like in life and what your personality is like and so forth. Because everything we say is irrelevant if you can't match it up with yourself, right? You know, I had a friend of mine when I was at Lehman, and you know, he was on the capital markets side, and he was laughing, and he said, you know, I would just be terrible in M&A or consulting because I have an extremely short attention span, you know? So I'm ideal for trading where, you know, if you don't make a decision in about 30 seconds, you know, it's gone by. But he said, I just can't do it. He was laughing because he said, I have a 2-year-old son and my wife thinks we have about the same attention span, right? But, so there's an example where he understood himself and he realized that if they ever put him in an M&A department, you know, where you work on things that are 6 months long, right? Or God forbid, into consulting, where you might work on long projects, he may or may not have the analytical skills, but he just wouldn't have the fit in a person, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that in terms of it. It actually segues into the second question in terms of, you know, a character trait that I find in the successful people in any organization. And that is a passion for what they're doing. This fits them. This is what they're interested in. So before we go there, maybe there are other questions on the first point. They want to hear the answer to the second one.
Okay. And by the way, anyone who's watching by streaming video, please send any questions you might have. And I'm looking here on my iPad, so I'll watch for them. So you want to go into the second one. The second one is this question of what kind of people tend to do well or not well, and what kind of people tend to be happy or not happy, and you know what appears to be the difference in the profession. Greg, you want to start off?
Yeah, well, taking on that point, I think the key factor is a passion for what you're doing. So now, as Peter also pointed out, every organization has a variety of subsets to it, and we're trying to address the general. You know, you go into an organization, during the interview process, learn as much about what you're actually going to be doing, what part they're going to put in, and then ask yourself, you know, do I really want to do that? Right? Because the people who are forcing it, okay, this is a great organization, but I don't really like what I'm doing, they're never going to be successful at it. They're never going to get what they could out of that. In the finance area, in the investing area, and I ask people, do you read the New York Times? Well, I read the. Do you read the Wall Street Journal? I ask them, and they say no. You know, but I read the New York Times. But you don't get up every morning wanting to know everything that's happened in the investing world, and if you don't, you're not going to be really good at it, right? So one of the keys.
More importantly is if you didn't set up your own brokerage account and trade stocks, probably you're not that interested either, right?
That's right.
Right?
If someone wants to get into the investment world, if you've never owned a stock, right? Now,
That's
somebody said, I didn't have a cent. That would be one thing, but that would be a sign. So why do you want to work in an investing firm, et cetera? It has to be sort of in the fabric of what you want to do, right? And that's number one, the successful person, right? And the other attributes, you know, segue into what I said earlier. The successful person, there are people who come on and can do the job. The people that I've noticed throughout my career, are the people who take the initiative to do something out of the ordinary, beyond what they are specifically requested to do, right? And that's going to be really hard when you start, unless you bring in all the data and the information, because you like understanding the industry that you're in, right? So it all traces back to that, I think.
I would also say that one other difference between the three that should be linked to whether there's a fit or not is this issue of whether you are implementing what you know, some product, creating a product, or anything. Consulting, you're solving problems, but at the end, you give a recommendation, and the client either follows it or not, but it's their job to implement it. So you could say the product is the analysis, but the reality is you're not actually implementing what's happening. That's not necessarily bad, but it's just the way it is. Investment banking, some of it's like consulting, but a lot of it are actual products, right? You're raising the capital, right? You're actually physically making making it happen, right? And in private equity, you're buying a company, and you either make it successful or not, but you've got to work at it. You're not just giving some recommendation and walking away. So that's a distinction. Consulting, you're tending to do an analysis and you hand it to someone to implement. Investment banking, it's mostly more implementing things, and definitely investing. You're making an investment, right? And so you got to live with that investment, and it could be investment where you got to live with for years, right?
That's right. If I try to make a generalization, I think in investment banking as well as consulting, another important skill set is being able to work in a team format. In the investing world, since, as we pointed out earlier, you don't deploy as many people and you hire the consultants who are looking for the judgment, but are looking at extremely successful people, the guys who end up being the partners or the managing directors. They're able to manage teams. They were able to be a part of a team, to compose a team, work as a team, and leverage the ability to have a team. There was a strong emphasis on that in McKinsey versus asking, well, what did you do? Versus, how did your team function?
The other thing I would make a sing about is the presence of chaos, right? If you look at those three professions, I would say, before I was ranking according to, one set of things, well, there's another thing, which is, can you deal with uncertainty and constant change where whatever you're working with keeps changing, or what you're working on keeps changing, or whatever. The one extreme, I think, is more investment banking. I cannot think of a day in the last 20 years where my day was what I thought it was going to be when I started. And constantly, because you're working on a wide variety of different things, and things are changing and so forth. I have one colleague from my firm here. I think he would agree, right? That every day he looks back, say, well,
I mean, this is what I'm doing right
there's some similarity. There's some similarity to most of his chaos is because I changed what he asked me to do, but it keeps changing. Consulting is more, you're working on a project, and there's less change and constant change in it. There is some. A client might change their mind about it, but it's less within each day, care. In investing, depending upon what kind of investing you do, right? If it's stock market investing, then it could be very, very short cycles. But if it's buying companies, we're measuring it in years, not in days and weeks. But you ought to ask yourself whether you have that kind of mentality. There's some people who basically say, I just can't do something for which I don't know if it's successful for 4 or 5 years, right? There's some people. There are others who say, I am totally comfortable with that, right? And there are some people who say, I want my day to go the way that I planned it, right? In which case, investment banking is a terrible place, right? And there are others who say, I like the chaos, right? I like the variety, and I like the fact that each day it doesn't turn out the way I originally thought. So they're not good or bad. They're different, but the more important thing is just for you to be aware of those differences and be able to say, okay, how do I fit, right? Am I the person who can work on something and see it for 4 years, or am I someone, so it's more a question of, where the fit is, right?
No, absolutely great. In the venture capital world, you don't know which way your day is going. Most likely when you get a phone call something bad has happened.
But you also can't walk away from it.
No,
I mean,
and you're living with it.
I remember, thank God it wasn't an investment I made. J.H. Whitney, who goes with the Whitney Family Venture Group, they made an investment in a company, and it was a disaster, right? But they couldn't say, oh, that was a disaster, so we'll just move on, right? They had their money invested in it, and they had to work it out and prevent it from turning into a big disaster, right? And so, but you have to be able to live with that, right? You have to be willing to be in a business where if it's exciting and good things happen, that's great, but if it's difficult, you have to live with being in a business where you can't walk away, right? From it. Let me ask if there are any other questions before we move on to the next. Wow, easy audience, right? So our next one is, what questions well, we've partly gotten into this already, but what questions should you ask yourself if you're trying to decide between the three professions? We sort of got partly in that, but not totally.
Yeah, I guess if I were to drill down a little bit more on that question, since, as I said earlier, you do one thing, you can do the other thing, etc., right? So I find it, as I advise young people like yourselves, what to do, stop stressing about whether it's this company or that company or this profession, investment banking or consulting, because as I said, despite a slight disagreement from Peter, they're all the same when you step back at it. I'll tell people, think about where you want to be 10 years from now, right? And if you're coming out of school, know that you have not acquired all the skills that you need to be where you are 10 years from now if you have really big visions of where you want to be. So go to a place where you will acquire that. Now that being said, in these large organizations, I think what's more important is the team or the people that you're going to be working with and the compatibility of what you're going to be doing at this particular organization, because most likely the place you're going to hire you are the big organizations versus the small ones, I would think, unless they're just looking for a junior fill-in position. And that's the thing that you have to really say, look, am I excited not only with the subject matter, am I excited working with this particular team? Now, as I was looking at a transition, and a mentor of mine many years ago said, big firm, small firm, it all boils down to 10 people, the 10 people you're going to be working with, right? And that's basically going to be your world. And that's what's important to get right, along with an area that you're really interested in, and people you're really working with and that you're interested in, and hopefully maybe somebody who will take an interest in you, right? Which means that you might be locked on philosophically and so forth. And that's the most important thing as you figure out where you want to be in your careers.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I also think I'm a strong believer in talking to people and following people around. I mean, the ideal person to talk to is someone who knows something about you, but also knows the profession. That is very hard, right? Because the number of people who know you is more limited, and most of the people who know you are still in school, right? So it's kind of a problem. But if you can find some way to get someone, who can get to know you, an internship, right? Go to consulting, see if you can get an internship, so that by the end of the summer they know you, but you also get to know what the job is like. That's the ideal, right? And then they can also help you decide. But it's very hard, right? Because the very nature is in your school, right? The people out there already working are less likely to know you. The best shot is if you have a friend who knew you, who was a little bit older and went off and went into consulting or investing and so forth. Because they're a friend, they're going to be honest, Second, they may know you, or at least know you better than a stranger, and they have some experience in that industry. The big challenge, of course, is they might be quite different. So their biases may turn out to be, wrong because they're answering it from the point of view of what they like, right? So you have to do a bunch of translating and hope that you know that person and why they're different, from you. So it's a little bit complicated, but that's what I would try to do, which is try to get some intersection between people who know the profession, people who know a little about you. See if you can find some way to have that intersect.
Yeah, I think that's right. Not to belabor the point, but let me give you a simple example of what happens in investment banking, consulting, or investing. You'll get the message. Right? Investment banking, guy comes up to you and says, "How much is my company worth, and what can I sell it for?" Okay, you're an investment banker. You try and help them figure it out and find a buyer at that price, or IPO it at that price. Right? Consultant. Here's my company. How can I make it more valuable? So you figure out, okay, what does your company produce, and how much income does it generate? How much did it cost you to build it? Second step of valuation. And what are the other companies worth? And then let's see what can add value, what are they doing, and so forth. But value question again. In investing, right? I need more money. How much will you give me for how much equity I'm willing to give you? Well, what's the value of your company? So it's all the same, right? And basically, the most important thing is, okay, if you're in any of these fields, you're trying to figure out valuation, what's the best environment for you to learn, right? Stepping aside and helping somebody else who's running the company, doing a transaction and figuring it out, or putting your own money into it. But it all comes back to the skill sets. The differential might be what route. And some people like transactions, some people like sitting back and advising, and some people want to have skin in the game. Decide what's right for you.
But here's where I'm going to differ with you.
Yeah,
You don't
go ahead.
totally agree. You talk in terms of the consulting thing, so how do I make my business more valuable? So you're making everything a valuation thing. I totally disagree. Most of the stuff I did at Bain & Company didn't have to do with how do I make the thing more valuable. It's how do I gain market share? How do I protect against and so forth. They may eventually end up indirectly with value, but the reality is or how do I reduce costs or so forth. So, my own view on consulting is that it's not just about valuation, right? And in many cases, the projects that I worked on were totally unrelated to valuation, right?
Oh, you were trying to achieve that. Whenever we did pricing, for example, pricing a study, and people would say, wow, well, you had to, the net effect was to deliver value to the company that was a multiple of your fees. In the back of your mind, was I going through a mental exercise where I was trying to make this client more valuable? That's what it comes down to.
Well, that's justifying your fee. That's how you explain to your client why you're charging.
No, the only reason the client comes to you is to improve the value of their company. You can say it's improved the operations, but the operations improves the value of the company. Ultimately, it all comes down to, whenever you're in business, a valuation.
Well, I think we would disagree there, because there are all sorts of kind of consulting. There could be human resource consulting. How do I make people happier, or have lots of turnover? How do I,
That's
how do I prevent?
there is human
There
resource.
could be cost reduction. There could be, should I stay in this? Should I go into Asia, for which, valuation may be only one element of. I'm not saying valuation isn't an element in consulting, but I think investment banking is much more oriented toward valuation. And I think certainly investing, it's all about how do I get return on my capital. So ultimately, whether you gain market share or not, the issue is how do I create value for the equity, right? But I think consulting can be a valuation exercise, but at times the assignment, isn't about valuation, right?
And no one's always about that.
Yeah, no, it's.
I would disagree with you.
So I would just say it can vary, but I think in that respect, I think there's more similarity between investing in private equity and investment banking than there is with consulting, right? And there's a bunch of consulting that may just be informational. I mean, we do life sciences and chemicals. There are a bunch of consulting firms that all you get hired for is your information, right? You know, IMS Health, they got tremendous data on what's the growth rate in Asia, generic versus ethical, whatever it is, so forth. And the reports they give have nothing to do with the company, but they have to do with where's the growth in Asia or where's the growth in generic, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
And we got to be very careful not to get bogged down in saying that all consulting is strategy consulting, because the reality is, you know, it's not. And that's my only point, right?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, that's right. So the last question we had here was, what do you ask recruiters to sort out the hype versus the reality? We talked about this.
Never ask a recruiter to sort out the hype versus reality. It's sort of, you know, the throwaway question of, well, what are the good things and the bad things? The recruiter is paid, right, to make sure that anybody they extend an offer to accepts the offer, number one. Number two, anybody they don't extend the offer to, right, goes away with a good feel that was a great organization, an opportunity missed. I don't think I've ever met a recruiter, you know, other than someone who was actually not a good employee, not a faithful employee, who would tell you the downsides of the company. They might tell you, hey, listen, we expect you to work hard here, right? And we expect you to you know, get along without the nurturing that you might have had in college or whatever else, right? But I don't think you penetrate the hype by asking the recruiter. You know, you have to do your own homework and talk to people who are in the firm.
Yeah, I firmly believe that by the time you talk to a recruiter, if you haven't done your own homework elsewhere, you're making a mistake. And, you know, it's amazing what people will ask me in interview. Right? It's just amazing, right? And smart kids, right? So some, they use it like an informational thing. How many people in your firm, you know, how long do people, and you say, and like within 2 minutes you say, this is not a person I'm going to hire, because this is information they could have gotten themselves, right, before they talk to me, right? The other is, don't use a recruiter as your career counselor, right? And we have people come in and say, oh, you know, I'm trying to decide, you know, is this or this, or should this or that, and, you know, and the same reaction, which is, you know, this person has forgotten what my job is, a recruiting job, which is to figure out whether you're going to be, I should give you an offer, right, or not. I'm not a counselor, right? So the one thing I would say is, do your homework. Do your homework about yourself, right? You know, whoever it is who's going to help you figure out what you want to do and why and whatever. And really do your homework about the company that you're talking to before you talk to them, right? By the time you talk to them, you should have if you're serious about them, every piece of information that they should have reasonably expected that you would be able to get without actually being in the company, right? And the kinds of questions you should ask, because they always say what questions, should be thoughtful ones that were based on already, you know, knowledge of the company, but a more thoughtful kind of question that's sort of a second or third tier. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that's the one thing you could do to the recruiter, rather than ask for information about the good things and the bad things of the position, is ask a question that might challenge them and give them a way out without having the negative come out. The recruiter might appreciate that. But in terms of getting info on what you're going to do that's negative to the company, I don't think recruiters do that other than the generic. Yes, you'll work hard. Yes, the people here are very challenging, right? And there are emergencies or something like that. But
yeah, and absolutely don't believe everything they say. Because remember what their job is. That's what Greg said. Their job is to get the best people, and it's not and to get them to say yes. and not necessarily suffer the consequences if it turns out wasn't quite the right decision for the person, right? I remember I was talking to a person who is a senior at Yale, and he was one of our finalists, right? And he said, I'm trying to decide between XYZ consulting firm, well-known consulting firm, and your firm. If it's investment banking, I've already decided I want to work for young partners. If it's consulting, it's XYZ consulting firm. And, but then he said, you know, the firm said, I'm going to see the world, I'm going to so forth, so on. You know, and I felt very, very badly because it was very difficult for me to have to pierce the hype, right? What am I going to say? Look, I know that firm, and if you end up, you're more likely to be assigned on a consulting project in Marshalltown, Iowa. You'll get on a plane, you can go to Marshalltown on Monday, and then you'll come back on Friday, and all your best friends are your team members from that firm because you don't see anyone else. And I mean, that's more the reality. It's not that you're going to spend the first year in Paris and France, Italy, and whatever. But it was very difficult because I'm recruiting. You can't say that. So all I said is, please do your homework, because not what they've told you is not necessarily. And don't believe necessarily what I'm going to say either. You know, go out and try to get information. By the way, one other thing is the one thing I would say is, don't be susceptible to fads. You know, we're all susceptible to fads. Young people are particularly susceptible to fads, right? And if it's the fad thing to do, ask yourself whether it really, is in fact the wrong answer, right? So, and this is not just undergraduates, this is business school, so forth. People tend there tend to be fads, right? So the current fad, which I happen to think is a wonderful thing, is entrepreneurism. But the reality is there's as many difficult things about being an entrepreneur and how difficult it is and the probability of success. I don't want to discourage people from that, but there's a lot of hype about entrepreneurs. Just like a couple of years ago, there was a lot of hype about private equity, right? So it goes around in cycles and so forth. So all I would say is, just make sure you understand what are fads versus reality, right? Because fads are what they are. Sometimes fads are good and they're right, but sometimes, it turns out they're just a terrible thing, right?
I see a ton of people I've advised over the years who have gone and done a variety of the big institution things, now turning into entrepreneurship. If it's just part of the learning process and something to get their feet wet and understand what it takes to build a business, that's one thing. And I find many of them learning that they don't have what it takes, and so, okay, that's fine. So I said earlier, you have a ton of years, so that's integral to your learning process. I did it for a couple of years after I left McKinsey. Worked with a startup, sat in a concrete room facing a parking lot trying to figure out how to design software. Decided I really didn't like to do it, right? And decided it was a lot more fun having other people do the work and present their ideas and handing them money if I felt they were working hard enough, right? So I see a lot of people, it's almost, in fad proportions, but I do happen to think that as things are disintermediated, I think the normal form of employment is going to change remarkably in the next 20 years over your career. I wouldn't necessarily focus on a career in investment banking or consulting. They might not exist. Right? The really exciting things are going to be outside in employment without organizations. Think about that. There are many more people employed today without organization, gainfully employed. And so learning the aspects of building a business, I think, are in fact important. And so I'm on the balance of whether or not, what is a fad may be the trend. Right? I've put out there, try to get the stats here, but I think that 30 years from now, the majority of people are not going to be working for organizations. They'll be employed, but they will be self-employed, not necessarily in the restaurant or a business they started, but they will market their services, and a number of enterprises will buy those services, and there will be multiple forms of work. So you'll have to learn that.
Well, I think Greg makes one good point, which is look ahead, because pretty much every profession that any of you are looking at is going to be different 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And the reality is, if you go into a profession, it isn't for 3 years. And let's go through a lot. Investment banks going through a radical structural change. The rules that are being imposed on investment banks and so forth. I had dinner with a friend of mine at Goldman Sachs who said, we were just talking about the rules that each of our firms have to be under now and how that's changing the whole nature of the business. It's going to be radically different. Working in an investment bank and what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do 10 years from now is going to be very, very different. Another example, medical profession, something I know well because we do life sciences. What it's like to be a doctor, totally different, right? You know, your image of a doctor is someone, you know, you have an office practice, you have see patients and so forth, people love you. The reality is already 2/3 of doctors now work as an employee for a hospital, and it just, all the individual practitioners are getting driven out because they can't deal with all of the paperwork, the insurance, and the liability and so forth. So you get to be a paid employee of, you know, of a hospital and so forth. Very different than what the image of a doctor is, you know, for most people. So I would encourage you, try to figure out from people who might know what the profession you're thinking about might be 10, 20 years. So beyond 20 years, who cares, right? But it's got to be a view that's at least 10 years out, right? Because that's your career, you know, that's your career. Now we have a question here that you're most suited to answer from Shannon Guy. Says, do you have any book recommendations for people interested in the world of investing, particularly private equity? So that's your question.
Oh, boy. The one I'm reading right now, Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1, I think it's a fascinating premise. And so there are other books that I think might build an interesting background, but I think in every which way I see the world really, really changing rapidly, and the whole topic of this discussion has been, right, you know, what do I see in the people who will succeed, et cetera, right? The world is changing rapidly, and I think Peter's book is a very interesting change, or very interesting to think about. Recasts the way people have thought about reading competition and improving on it versus monopoly, for example. And it's a very simple read. You can read Peter's book in a couple of hours. And I wouldn't say just take the top line and walk away with it. Within the pages, it says some very interesting things.
Now, we certainly have to have some more questions from the audience. Any questions that people would like to raise? We can't be that good as a panelist, right? Let me just do a casual survey. Raise your hand if you are interested in consulting. Okay. Raise your hand if you're interested in investment banking. And raise your hand if you're interested in investing. Okay. Interested, right? So what are you doing on the panel? For those of you on the streaming video, there were a large, you can't see the hands, there were a large number of hands for investment banking, a large number of hands for consulting. Many of the hands were the same for both, which obviously makes sense that they're here, but no one raised their hand for investing, so you've been voted off the island.
You know, I I was at a museum in New York City, and someone came up to me who had been a former extern, just a one-week program that some of the Yale students had put together, and they could shadow. And he said, "Oh, you're Greg Ho," and I said, "Yes." And I was an extern 4 years ago, and I said, "Oh, great. What are you doing now?" And she said, "Consulting." She said, "The time at your firm convinced me that I did not want to do investment." I said, "Thank you." So I said, no, I really learned something. It was really, really something important.
Yeah, that's right. We're almost at the end, and by the way, both of us are happy to stay for a little time to chat with you. But one of the things I do want to mention, since we do want to end on time, is that there will be, this has been a series of career panels. The next one is November 5th, which will be on consulting. And we have some people from 3 different consulting firms who will be talking candidly about what it's like or not like, and you can compare it to what we say and find out, you know, how it's different and so forth. The other is that if any of you have follow-on questions or whatever, just send an email. I'm happy. You could either send it at yalecareerpanels@gmail.com, and then we'll direct it to the right person to respond to you. Because we were very, very happy to be helpful, because I'm sure 2 or 3 days from now you'll say, well, a question will occur to you, or that may just be personal, right, about a resource or a book or so forth. So I encourage you to do that. And I also, I'm sure, based on the number of hands, that we'll see a few of you on November 5th. It's going to be from 4:30 to 5:30, same format, except that we're going to connect a meeting room here with a meeting room in New York so we can accommodate more alumni. This one we tried to focus on students, right, because it's kind of logical, right, that students are having to choose, right, between professions. You're out a couple of years and so forth. It still may be true, but a little less of an issue than what you're facing now. So I want to thank all of you, and for those of you who are watching by streaming video, we're happy that you're participating. And by the way, this is being recorded, I think, and will be available to watch later on. We'll send information on how you can see it, particularly if you have a friend that, for example, couldn't make it because they have a class or a paper to write. Okay? So thank you very much.